the McBride Center for International Business, International Studies, Armstrong Browning Library, and of course, the Keston Center. Thank you, sponsors and interim dean of Baylor University Libraries, John Wilson. There he is, for joining us and for supporting our efforts. If you're part of one of those sponsoring departments, would you please stand? Libraries, Keston, MFL, whatever you is. In 1959, Michael Bordeaux, one of the first British exchange students in the USSR, received a note from Russian Christians asking for help. Once in Moscow, he witnessed religious atrocities firsthand. After a divine meeting with the very women who penned the letter, he took up their call to be the voice of the voiceless, and in 1969 established the Keston Institute to make known the needs of all religious believers and to uphold religious freedom in every case. A vast library and unique archive formed Keston's core, and in 2007, the Keston Institute passed its stunning collection of religious persecution and religious freedom literature to the newly created Keston Center at Baylor University to preserve the resources and to promote research on religion under communism and other totalitarian societies. Today, the center both welcomes researchers such as one we have join us today from the Czech Republic. Marta, would you stand up? Today was her first day. She'll be glad to tell you what she's already found this morning. And we host lectures such as this one. Dr. Joshua King, Associate Professor of English and the Margaret Ruth Brown Chair in Robert Browning and Victorian Studies, will introduce our speaker. I will later recognize our distinguished panel who will respond to the lecture. Josh.
Well, it's a pleasure to be introducing Dominic Erdozain to you. Just over a year ago, I witnessed Dominic deliver a paper from that side of the room for a conference we organized here on religion and literature and religious history of the 19th century more broadly. He'd come very highly recommended by one of today's best-known historians of religion, Tim Larson, at Wheaton. Tim had written me saying that Dominic was one of the most exciting younger historians working on religion, and urged me to consult Dominic's 2015 book with Oxford University Press, The Soul of Doubt, The Religious Roots of Unbelief, from Luther to Marx. I've been continually grateful that I followed Tim Larson's lead in encouraging Dominic to join us for the conference. His presentation was brilliant, and has since become the basis of an essay he wrote for a collection I've co-edited on constructing 19th century religion. Speaking of edited collections, Dominic has himself recently finished a collection of essays called The Dangerous God, Christianity, and the Soviet Experiment, which contains contributions from two of our panelists, Wallace Daniel and Julie Graffman. So it's a chance that while he was finishing his chapter for me, he was editing their chapters. And so Wallace and Julie, if Dominic has been at all irritable at any time, then I'm sorry. Dominic, formerly at King's College London, is now living in Atlanta, having moved there with his wife's work for CNN. And he is already bringing his scholarship into dialogue with his new national situation. He's begun a new history of religion in the U.S. gun culture called Arming Jesus, that's a good one, the religion of the gun in America. Dominic's work, whether in Soul of Doubt, The Dangerous God, or his numerous articles, has incisively troubled the boundary between the secular and the religious, showing how religion has been the source of dissidence in secular contexts, and how avowedly secular projects and ideas, including those of Marx, owe secret, often repressed debts to moral and religious conscience, and to Christianity in particular. Today, in his talk, Holy Fools, Faith and Freedom in Soviet Russia, he will emphasize one other such untold story, one that They have the powerful role played by Christianity in confronting and creatively resisting Soviet-era social engineering, thereby challenging the myth of a messianic state in which all too many citizens had come to believe. So, thank you, Dominic.
Thank you very much, Josh, for that introduction, and thank you, Kathy, especially for inviting me. Whatever Tim Larson says, this does feel a little awkward for me to be here with distinguished panels such as people like Julie, Philip, and Wallace on the bench. It kind of reminds me, to some degree, of English football, which, as you may know, is famous for its kind of recruiting blunders, whereby the scouts persuade a manager to sign some absolute stinker of a player based on an exotic surname. And sort of tenuous affiliations Cristiano Ronaldo within minutes of them playing, all is revealed, and you become a quiz question. You can Google these things. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for giving me more than 6 minutes of some of these infamous characters. In a footnote to his autobiography, Nikolai Berdiaev's sister-in-law tells a story about a mysterious visitor to Moscow in the winter of 1913. The family was having lunch when the servant announced that the unknown visitor wanted to see Berdiev. A tall man in a black coat was ushered in. He had an eagle profile and long grey hair which fell on his shoulders, and he reminded me of Viking. We were all struck by his magnificent presence. We learned later that he came to Moscow from Germany on a mission, sent by the White brothers to inform Berdiev that they followed his activities and acted as his guardians. He spent 3 days with us. He impressed everyone with his exceptional attention to people, kindness, sensitivity, and unusual penetration into their characters. On New Year's Eve, he took part in a banquet. Everyone was happy and merry. Only Dr. Lubeck, as his name was, kept silent, sitting with a head bent in sadness. Asked to say something, he replied, "I did not want to upset your happy mood, but if you insist, I must tell you that very soon Europe will be shaken by the hurricane of war. Russia will be defeated. After it, your country will pass through one of the most sweeping revolutions in world history." Less mystical, but no less prophetic, was Leo Tolstoy's prediction of a coming revolution. Now, Berdiev's book was published in 1960, nearly 50 years after this numinous encounter. And Berdiev was, it must be said, he had a lowish credence threshold for affirming supernatural events. One of his works contains the immortal footnote, "This was once revealed to me in a dream." Tolstoy, on the other hand, no mistake, subscribing as he did to an austerely ethical interpretation of Christian faith. So his comment in a book published in 1894 stands as an even more striking premonition of the violence of the coming century. "We are standing," he wrote, on the threshold of the murderous war of social revolution, terrific in its miseries, besides which the horrors of 1793 will be child's play. The allusion was to the French Revolution and the terror that followed, Tolstoy perceiving that the logic of revolutionary justice would sanction crimes greater than the cruelties of the Tsars. As he wrote to the ardent young revolutionary, naming the paradox of humanitarian violence, quote, "Love is a very dangerous word. You know that very bad acts are committed in the name of love for the family. Worse ones still, in the name of love of country, and the most terrible horrors in the name of love of humanity." Horrors committed in the name of humanity may be a fair and incisive summary of Soviet communism, a system that remained ambitious and idealistic even in barbarism. Christianity was not the only force that confronted this experiment in social engineering, but it was one of the most powerful in its subtle way, and one of the most penetrating. It was powerful because it supplied resources of resistance, helping people to survive what has been called the anthropological catastrophe of the Soviet era. It was penetrating insofar as it equipped people to see through and beyond the cosy problems of a bloodletting superstate. So the freedom of a Christian in the Soviet Union was physical and emotional, generating heroic alternatives to the passivity of Soviet norms. It was also, in many cases, critical and intellectual, setting limits to Soviet ideology and perhaps sowing the seeds of its demise. It's easy, as Wallace Daniel writes in his recent book on Alexander Men, to assume that narratives of defiance were somehow the norm in Soviet Russia, that freedom was on everyone's lips. The sobering reality was that, and I'm quoting Wallace here, Soviet citizens generally internalized its value system, buying into what Albert Weinberg has termed the grim romanticism of the totalitarian state. Wallace quotes a Russian historian who writes that, quote, "The real power, the lasting legacy of the Stalinist system were neither in the structures of the state nor in the cult of the leader, but in the Stalinism that entered into all of us." As Alexander Yakovlev recalled, we thought one thing, said another, and did a third. Against all of this, Christianity offered an alternative reality. Now, sometimes, of course, believers collaborated, colluded with the state, annexing the church to the atheist state. And chapters by Michael Bordeaux and Geraldine Fagan address this very awkward question of KGB and Cossack, in Cossack, sorry, slip of the tongue. Geraldine Fagan in particular sort of names this a scandal in a sense. So we don't want to be too rosy in our nostalgia about this, but other times Christianity was doubt and dissent in the Soviet Union, demystifying the revolution. First, however, physical freedom, survival. How did Christians withstand the waves of persecution unleashed in the service of the communist utopia? It might seem odd to talk about freedom in the context of incarceration. Anyone who's read a reading of Erdozain's luminous memoir, Grey is the Colour of Hope, will appreciate its paradox. With brave and untiring humour, Erdozain explains why hunger strikes in the isolation cell were preferential to her than the petty humiliations of the Gulag, such as the requirement to wear an identity tag. She explains how the line, once drawn, became a source of confidence and inner strength, holding her tormentors in check. The decision over the badge was a spiritual one, made in the conscience and with prayer. But once made, it assumed an authority of its own. Erdozain's memoir speaks of a rare kind of liberty, sparkling in perception and generous in attitude. Realizing early in her captivity that the game was being played on this almost prosaic ground of daily humiliation, she simply refused to play it. Political prisoners of her special zone were polite, kind, but utterly ungovernable. Women of iron character who developed a rhythm of resistance and a code of solidarity. When a KGB officer finally delivered her back to freedom, she found herself offering him a cup of coffee. She immediately felt awkward about her gesture of hospitality, which was duly declined. And then she said to herself, without a hint of self-importance, "What of it that I offered a KGB man a cup of coffee? I am the victor, not he." Survival. Another luminary of physical freedom is Alexander Ogorodnikov, Christian convert and activist for believers' rights, who suffered numerous imprisonments, really during that third wave of persecution unleashed after Khrushchev. And he was imprisoned many times in the 70s and 80s. The very moment that the Russian Orthodox hierarchy was conducting a charm offensive on the World Council of Churches, cheerfully denying rumours of abuse within the USSR, Ogorodnikov was enduring a series of harrowing punishments, tortures, and hunger strikes for the privilege of being able to read his Bible. Now, there's enormous pathos in his story, as trusted friends were persuaded to leave him, but there is also a consistent theme of transformation, as often hostile inmates were drawn to his example and his faith, so much so that he began to understand his time in prison as not a punishment, but a mission. Mostly people were drawn to his character and his fearless response to hardship. On other occasions, character combined with moments of apparent transcendence. Ogorodnikov recalled an incident when an unfriendly group of prisoners ordered him to remove his clothes. Quote, "I only give my own clothes away to people who really need them," he answered, "but not under coercion." Guessing that he was a Christian because he greeted them with the words, "Peace be with you," they asked him for a miracle, quite a particular one. "Pray to that God of yours to bring us cigarettes. Then we'll believe in him too." "Smoking poisons the body," Ogorodnikov responded, "and I'm sure the Lord thinks so too. But I also think the Lord will answer your appeal out of love and have mercy on you because of your dreadful living conditions." The atmosphere sharpened as Ogorodnikov invited the men to sit and pray with him. An excruciating 15 minutes followed before the cell door opened and a handful of cigarettes were scattered on the floor by one of the guards. Cause, as Bertrand Russell once wrote, is an elusive thing. But a man who spent more than 600 days combined on a hunger strike for the right to read his Bible is entitled to the benefit of the doubt. This incident taught Ogorodnikov something about the character of his God. These particular men believed. On another occasion, he was placed in a cell with 2 criminals who had been sentenced to death, in fact, to die the following day. The guard had told them that their sentences would be rescinded if they were able to kill their new cellmate. Ogorodnikov entered deep discussions with them, convinced them that this promised review of their trial was a lie. He kept vigil with both men through the night, was able to pray with them before they were taken away before dawn. Grim as the ending of this story was, the relationship that he was able to form with the men before their death was testimony to the power and agility of his faith. Ogorodnikov had learned to pray a simple prayer during his hardest trials: "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." And after a while, he said, the prayer began to pray itself, following the rhythm of his breathing and heartbeat. He prayed not only during the day, but at night, silently and ceaselessly. Gradually, he said, he began to experience a kind of spiritual detachment, no longer tormented by his hunger. With his countenance sometimes fixed in a serene smile, the guards thought he was becoming demented or trying to provoke them. This, too, was freedom. If I could just break for a moment. The cover, the image we managed to source thanks to Marisa on the cover of the book is actually a cross that was made for Alexander Ogorodnikov by his fellow prisoners, I think during one of his periods in isolation. If this was made by non-Christians, it would be very consistent with the theme of the book, which is kind of almost the respect earned by non-believers for believers. We don't know exactly who actually made it, but he gave the cross itself to Athanasius Hart, who held a vigil for him in London, and the photograph was given to Keston. He's an extraordinary character. I know he's visited Baylor. Even more remarkably, perhaps, he after his release, many years later, he met one of the KGB officers who'd authorised his tortures, and the man saluted him with the phrase, "You never compromised." He also confessed that the ex-KGB man confessed that he'd become a Christian and asked Alexander if he'd be his spiritual mentor. Honoured, no doubt, Ogorodnikov nevertheless said no. This would not be possible. He was no priest, but also he might have added he was a human being with memories and scars. It was quite typical of him in some ways to be honoured thus, but say no. After his release from prison, he set up a free school, a soup kitchen, and a shelter for orphans, continuing his quarrels with officialdom, who were refusing to pay bribes for basic services. But this is the spirituality of the Gulag, this large faith that is kind of stubborn and small things. So figures like Ratush, Inskaya, and Ogorodnikov reveal something that Dominic has written of the martyrs of the early church, and I love this phrase. He says that Christian obedience sometimes plays a troubling wild card. It disturbs patterns, it defies expectations, and rattles authority. It's what we, in plotting the nomenclature of our profession, call agency. Christians act in this way. Kindred to physical freedom, yet a distinct and striking aspect of Christian witness in Soviet Russia was emotional and aesthetic freedom. Soviet zeal for purity in the arts was in some ways an admission of ideological failure, a tacit acknowledgement that the new Soviet man had to be made, not given. If the economic base really did rule the superstructure, the cultural superstructure, then you wouldn't have to worry about the arts and propaganda, etc. But worry the party did. Art was quickly perceived as a vital battleground of a totalitarian project, and Stalin's words to a gathering of writers in 1932 are well known. Quote, "Our tanks are worthless if the souls that drive them are made of clay. So I say, the production of souls is more important than the production of tanks. Writers are the engineers of the human soul." And yet, socialist realism proved to be such a strenuous oxymoron that it fell to heretics to nourish a true and lasting aesthetic. By forcing the play with glorified propaganda, the regime was arguably highlighting the importance of real art. And it's striking how often Christians answer the call. Secularization theories promote the concept of absolute art, meaning art that has been literally absolved of its theistic or religious connections to achieve a bold Promethean autonomy. But in the Soviet Union, art was rarely autonomous, rarely untethered from deeper matters of the soul or older traditions of spirituality. It's striking that Ozrovnikov's conversion was stimulated by Pasternak, Dostoevsky, and Pasolini's iconic film, The Gospel According to St. Matthew. And it's often been said that the censors erred in failing to ban the classics of 19th century Russian literature, so rich in themes of spirituality and freedom. Yevgeny Yevtushenko located the origins of perestroika in the poetry readings of the 1950s, arguing that, quote, "a hidden glasnost has always existed in the nation's poetry and prose. Russian literature," he said, "is the literature of conscience." It was also a fund of creativity and emancipation. Poetry began as holy madness, wrote Elena Schwartz. How gorgeous poetry was when it dived into the sea of madness and came back up to the light of reason. In its predator's teeth, the pearl of an unreasonable thought. In the underground literary scene of Leningrad in the 1970s, poetry was a form of ideological resistance, injecting colour, festivity, and mischief into a grey and grey world. It was also, as Josephine von Zitzewicz writes in her chapter, enduringly spiritual, invoking the concept of the poet as wholly fool, to expose the absurdities of ideological conformity, and claiming a confrere in Jesus Christ, ever comfortable around society's troublemakers and misfits. But this was more than rebellion, it was transfiguration. The poet described in her chapter, while anything but orthodox or conventionally pious, managed to skewer the deadening seriousness of Soviet ideology, weaving colour into the tired garment of a prescribed culture. As one writer has summarised the magnetism of this literary subculture, quote, "People really wanted something meta, a different dimension in poetry that had been forgotten during the Soviet years. Soviet poetry was utilitarian, pure physics. What people wanted was metaphysics." So this ability to expose the thudding didacticism of Soviet ideology points to a third area of freedom, which was intellectual. Time and again, we find that faith is not a woolly hope or an emotional palliative, but a clear and articulate mental posture. This is evident from children who learn to, quote, "speak Bolshevik at school and a different language at home, as described by Julie Gravenry, to well-known intellectuals such as Pasternak, Solzhenitsyn, and Alexander Mann. It was as if the Christian faith provided a literal perspective, a vantage point from which the Soviet future could be historicised as the audacious experiment that it was. Christianity was, for many of these intellectuals, a way of seeing and a place from which to see. I love Wallace's description of Alexander Mann's vocation to the priesthood hardening in a moment of revulsion from the cult of Stalin, a scene reminiscent of the young Luther, rattled by the idol worship of Rome. That was my kind of spin on it. It was 1947, and Alexander stood with a friend in Red Square, where, I'm taking over from Wallace here, the party had placed, shining splendidly, a gigantic portrait of Stalin, lighted at night with a projector, an idol expecting enthusiasm and submission from his slaves. The friend recalled that Alexander turned to her and said that, quote, when he saw the portrait in the dark sky, it was precisely then that he understood that he had to become a priest. Religious faith was a solvent of the crashing simplicities of dialectical materialism, the crude, binary worldview that promoted even cruder actions. It was a walking rebuke to the illusion of a soulless anthropology, that minds could be owned by their environment. And it was a living challenge to that worst of all illusions, the illusion of cleansing violence. Christianity began to historicize its oppressor, that is, to cut it down to size by placing it within a broader, deeper narrative. Just as Marx historicized the church as a temporary victor, a pious stand-in for a mature and authentic class consciousness, Christian thinkers were able to historicize the Communist Party as the clumsy stand-in for a washed-out theory. And this is perhaps why so many of them were drawn to the study of the early church, the church fathers, the longue durée of religious history, and to Christianity's native tradition of returning the gaze of power. In Dr. Zhivago, Pasternak's Nobel Prize-earning novel of love and resistance under the skies of revolution, being, quote, true to Christ means refusing to bend the knee to Soviet ideology. Christ was, for Pasternak, the destroyer of the gods and the guardian of the individual. And when Christ came, when he came, and I'm quoting here, light and clothed in an aura, Pasternak writes, emphatically human, deliberately provincial, Galilean, at that moment, gods and nations ceased to be. And yet, then and only then, humankind came into being. So there's this idea of Christian simplicity demystifying the might of empires. Pasternak's novel is a masterpiece of theological deconstruction, a work of laser criticism empowered by a doctrine of life. Now, brief digression, I got interested in this theme of demystification when I took a train from London to Preston in northwest of England in the summer of 2012. My companion took an interest in my pile of library books and asked me where I was studying. Turned out that he was a rather distinguished gentleman called Hugh Lundy, who had worked as a translator during the Second World War, serving Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin at Tehran, Yalta and Potsdam, no less, and an important diplomatic figure who had broken meetings between Lord Mountbatten and Stalin after the war. He had these extraordinary anecdotes about Mountbatten making small talk about going sailing with the Romanovs, and Stalin wasn't apparently too impressed with that chatter. The list of Hugh's achievements is long, but on that 2-hour journey to Preston, he was eager to talk about Marxism and how it evolved into what he called a religion of hate. It was not, he urged, that Christians had somehow single-handedly dissolved this secular religion, but they had been quick to perceive its ideological hubris, and they were a critical part of the resistance. Hugh had worked for an organisation that aimed to combat KGB infiltration of trade unions and other organisations in the UK. I didn't ask him about his own faith, but he invited me to meet him a second time, where he gave me a handful of books on the Soviet Union, including 2 by Michael Bordeaux, vigorously annotated in his own hand. So when I finally met Michael Bordeaux at a conference here in Baylor, he said, "Oh yes, of course, I remember Hugh. He briefed me for my, I think, second visit to the Soviet Union in the 50s. So there's this nice link. It's been a privilege to be on the sort of lower end of that. But what I took from Hugh was this sense that Christians made a difference sometimes simply by giving others pause for thought. It didn't have to be a revolution in consciousness. Christians weren't there necessarily to provide a comprehensive alternative. As an anti-ideology, faith was entitled to be open and indeed slightly mysterious. And this, it seems to me, is the point of one of the major points of Dr. Zhivago. The brilliance of Pasternak's critique, to return to this, was that it contains sympathy and awe as well as dissent from the revolution. Pasternak acknowledges the humanity of the socialist ideal and the ambition of its executors. And with a phrase that could just as well be applied to our own culture wars, he says, "It's only in mediocre books that people are divided into 2 camps and have nothing to do with each other." Real Soviet crimes grew out of socialist virtues. Socialism, he affirms, was born in real concern for, quote, the human dignity of the poor, and in just revolt against, quote, the brute insolence of money. So that is why he is an insider, as a member of the intelligentsia, is such a kind of well-credentialed critic. All of this, he writes, was absorbed and expressed in Lenin, who fell upon the old world as the personified retribution of its misdeeds. So there is a kind of numinous, there's a kind of esteem here, but also a shuddering sense of horror of what it turned into. And for Pasternak, this path from Lenin to Stalin is a short and direct one. It's also a path that reaches back to Marx. And the savagery of Soviet terror was linked to the clarity of its ideas. A clean separation of historical forces and this casual appeal to historical destiny in the service of this retribution. Pasternak brilliantly portrays the descent from eager intellectualism to conscience-free killing in the character of Strelnikov, the shooter, whose addiction to the grand idea and glittering phrase was also Russia's. Bolsheviks were men beguiled by their own eloquence, frozen in second-hand thought, and desensitized to their own brutality. They were, in the end, intellectuals, but not thinkers. They knew how to destroy and not how to create. The Christianity that Dr. Zhivago sets against this is profound, but inevitably heterodox. It's anchored in the sacredness of creation, the sanctity of the human person, and the eternal possibility of redemption. But this idea of redemption is not feverishly teleological. It's not always driving towards a specific end, because that, of course, is the folly of Soviet ideology. Zhivago finds hope in ordinary things because he's learned to see. He finds immortality in common human discourse because Christ had shown that human discourse is always sacred. Some readers sense Philistinism in Pasternak's hymns to sleep, fresh air, and bowls of cabbage soup, but part of his critique of this kind of driving ideology of Bolshevism is that life must be lived, not planned. The secret of happiness was to work with the materials at hand, and this was where Christ had differed from other gods. Christianity, as Pasternak argued through the mental figure of Uncle Collier, is at home in the world. As Uncle Collier, a defrocked priest, urged in one of his languid, rising sermons, quote, "It has always been assumed that the most important things in the Gospels were the ethical maxims and commandments. But for me, the most important thing is that Christ speaks in parables taken from life, and he explains the truth in terms of everyday reality. The idea that underlies this is that communion between mortals is immortal, and that the whole of life is symbolic because it is meaningful. Faith for Uncle Collier and for Zhivago was no plodding sense of duty, but an inward music, a spirit of lightness and generosity towards a troubled world. It was this inward music, not the cudgel, that had raised humanity above the beast. Christianity was ethical, finding in the love of neighbour, quote, the supreme form of vital energy. But it was also an epistemology, a disposition, a posture towards the world. And that, Uncle Collier urged, is why people discover mathematical infinity and electromagnetic waves. That is why they write symphonies. For he continued, you can't advance in this direction without a certain faith. You can't make such discoveries without spiritual equipment. And the basic elements of this equipment are in the Gospels. To be true to Christ was thus to love the world, not to impose a vision upon it. Christianity was therefore a true doctrine of progress, and one that recognized the relationship between the means and the end. The revolution generated a torrent of words alien to life itself. White-eyed revolutionaries who boasted of, quote, reshaping life had never felt its breath. So to conclude, resistance began with Pasternak with a new appreciation of the sacredness of ordinary living. This novel in prose was a nudge, a question mark, a moment of clarity for the culture as a whole. In his classic study of the Russian religious renaissance of the 20th century, Nicholas Zernov wrote that, quote, the struggle between the Christians and Marxists in Russia raises a number of problems concerning not only the future of the church in Russia, but also the destiny of Christianity in the modern world. He also wrote with deep regret that the revival yearned for a time when voices like Erdozain, Volkov, and Florensky would be able to speak, though posthumously, to their own people. Florensky, of course, was martyred in 1937. Figures like Irina Ratushinskaya, Alexander Voronikov, Gleb Nikunin, Alexander Benin, and of course Pasternak show that these voices were heard, and that they did to some degree arrest the momentum of the revolution. The struggle between Christianity and the Soviet state raises disturbing questions about cruelty and providence, violence and civilization. That can't be denied. But it also suggests new understandings of providence, centered on hope and trust, rather than certainty and power. Indeed, it shows that power, even at its most ruthless and unfeeling, may be subject to scrutiny and rejection. Such was the freedom of a Christian in Soviet Russia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That gives us certainly a lot to think about and our panel a lot to talk about. Joining us on the panel this afternoon are several people who've already been referred to. Wallace Daniel, Julie DeGraff, and Kurt Jenkins. A Soviet scholar with extensive publications, Wallace Daniel earned his PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, a former Baylor History Department chair and dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Daniel, unfortunately for us, left Baylor to become provost at Mercer University, where he is currently Distinguished University Professor of History, and certainly our law school is there now. And we are very grateful for Dr. Daniel because he was instrumental in helping Baylor get the Keston collection here. After receiving her BA in History and Slavic Studies at Baylor and studying under Dr. Daniel, Julie DeGraff earned an MA and PhD at the University of Texas in Austin. Today she serves as Associate Professor of History at Baylor, where she was recently named Outstanding Faculty. Her research focuses on Soviet children's history and its intersection with anti-religious pro-atheism policies. And finally, a native of Wales, Dr. Jenkins received his PhD from Cambridge. He currently serves as Distinguished Professor of History at Baylor, the author of more than 20 books and numerous other publications. The Economist magazine has called him one of America's best scholars in religion. Each panelist will briefly respond to Dr. Erdozain's lecture and then participate with him in a question and answer time that he will moderate. Dr. Daniel, you all can come up here if you would like, and I'm going to we're going to pass the mic.
I've been thinking the whole time about that football analogy and what position each of us would play, and above all, how long we remain standing, particularly in my case, which would not be very long. But I love the analogy. The Russian Revolution is, in many ways, still with us. As William Faulkner said, the past is never dead. In fact, the past is not the past. And we think about his statement, when we look at his statement in the context of the 20th century, we know that, as you know, and we all know, that it was exactly 100 years ago that in February, March, huge crowds gathered on the streets of Petrograd, the name of St. Petersburg, during World War I, and overthrew the Romanov monarchy. And then, as you know, in October, precisely on this date, the old-style Russian calendar, on October the 25th, late at night, a group called the Bolsheviks came to power in Russia. Tragic event from my point of view that will have long-term tragic implications, but important implications. If one were to go to the New York Times on the morning of October 26th, old style, November 7th, our style, and look at the way that event was reported, one would find a small 3 or 4 line entry on page 1 down at the bottom. Now this was in the throes of the death grip of World War I, as you know. But in that small newspaper clipping, the reporter said that the Bolsheviks, a group called the Bolsheviks, had come to power in Russia. They would likely not last long. They were simply a group of anarchists. Now, that raises the question, who were the Bolsheviks and why are they significant? And what is the implication that they had on Russia and on world history? There are some who would say that this event is the most important political event of the 20th century, certainly tragically so. So let me make 2 or 3 points in trying to deal with that question. What stands out to me in Dominic's paper and his comments are several things. First, the Bolsheviks were a radical group. They believed in an apocalypse. They were true believers who thought that the world as they knew it was coming to an end. That is the theme of a brilliant new book by Yuri Shlovskin, a historian at Berkeley, who argues precisely that the Bolsheviks were a sect, a millenarial sect, a new kind of political party, but an old kind of sect. Those who joined them were required to give up their possessions. The Bolsheviks demanded total faith. They believed that they were creating, as I've said, a new world, a new society. They believed that socialism was entering a death thrust with capitalist Babylon. And they thought that what would happen in Russia, what happened in Petrograd on that fateful day, they thought that this would spread to the rest of the world. In other words, they were harbingers of a world revolution. They essentially made war on tradition, on the past, on the church, on Russian culture. We will not stumble into that bourgeois swamp, they argued. As one of them wrote, we are walking toward our children's country, toward the faraway promised land. We are walking in the dark without miraculous portents or burning bushes. We are walking with faith in ourselves. Idealistic, apocalyptic, prophetic. Again, this group came to power in 1917. They opposed our Christian ideals, political ideals, with ideals of vengeance, violence, self-sacrifice, and faith in a coming age of perfection. Now the second point, and this is something that really struck me in Dominic's paper. The alternatives. This utopian vision could not last. If this first generation of Bolsheviks were utopian idealists and expected a new world, that could not possibly last, that prophetic vision. And slowly, if the fathers had emphasized a new world, the sons and daughters of the Bolsheviks, of the fathers, by the late 1920s, certainly knew that that prophecy was not coming true, was not coming to pass, these sons and daughters of the Bolsheviks. And they had great disappointment. So what does one do in such disappointment? What they did was mythologize the Russian Revolution of 1917. November the 7th, new style, became the most important holiday for 50 years in the then Soviet Union, when everything closed down and everyone venerated this holiday. That's one way. And then, when the rise of Joseph Stalin took place in 1928, 1929, the image of the ideal was transmogrified or metamorphosized. So world revolution became socialism in one country. And then, to back up a couple of years, the dead Lenin was embalmed and placed on Red Square, where one went to see that body in a clear glass case when a Soviet citizen came to Moscow. These were myths that were created that were no longer living, no longer real, although it was said that Lenin lived, Lenin lives, Lenin will always live. Who believed in that, really? And while Lenin and Marx were studied in school and read in school, at home the children read Dickens and Tolstoy and Ernest Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald. And images of Christianity became, in many circles, particularly intelligentsia circles, the alternative. Now finally, the last point quickly, and I want to move forward to the present. Vladimir Putin, correctly, does not know what to do with the October Revolution. It's a mystery to him as to what to do. What I find really fascinating is that Vladimir Putin has a difficult time understanding or stating what the revolution means to him. He lives with the ghosts of history. He lives with the ghosts of 1917 and those big crowds. And he recently said to a group of students and young teachers about 1917, someone decided to shake Russia from inside and rock things so that the Russian state crumbled. A complete betrayal of national interests. What does history mean, he said? Well, that's for future generations to decide. And that indeed is the question that Russia and perhaps we are left with.
So Dominic sent us his paper, and I turned to Wallace today at lunch and I said, "Have you read The House of Government by Yuri Slotkin?" And he said, "Yes, that's what I'm going to talk about." So there's a lot there, I think, really to think about. Dominic, thank you for raising all of these ideas. And there's two things that I want to mention. So as I have gotten into recently research about religion in the Soviet Union, one of the things that's become really apparent to me, a question that I'm going to have to work out, is this tension between belief and actions. Right, and this is kind of a question that's inescapable when you talk about this. And I've had two quotes clipped to my computer for about the last month that I've been sort of chewing on. So one of them is by historian Josh Sanborn, who says, "The power of ideology lies not in inspiring belief, but in structuring action." Okay? The other one is by Czech writer and dissident and former president Václav Havel, who said, "Individuals need not believe in all of these mystifications." Look, there's your word, Dominic. Mystifications, okay. But they must behave as though they did. It is enough for them to have accepted their life with it and in it. For by this very fact, individuals confirm the system, fulfill the system, make the system, are the system. So this would suggest that engineers of the soul, quote, aside, that we might say the Soviet authorities were willing to concede the kinds of freedoms that Dominic is talking about, as long as your outward actions said something else. This internal immigration that elites, that writers, artists would talk about, that was okay as long as your actions remained in the system, right, as Havel would say. In other words, who cares what you think as long as you do the expected thing? Pasternak writing for the drawer, no problem. Getting published abroad, problem, right? Ratushinskaya writing poetry, no problem. But refusing to work with the KGB and circulating samizdat, underground literature, that's a problem. Right? So I think this is interesting. I'm a children's historian. childhood is where you catch a culture in high relief. Okay, so whatever you think about childhood, that can tell you a lot about a society. And so what the studies of, what my studies of the policies of religion in childhood and in children, I think, can really show us is the ways in which the party sought to do two things. One of those is to control actions, okay, and specifically children's actions. By closing and repurposing churches, we're changing the spaces in which children live their lives. By eliminating religious influences and substituting non-religious influences. By removing education from the church, which the vast majority of children prior to 1917, if they went to school, which is a big if, but if they went to school, they went to a school that was run by the church. By making it nearly mandatory and attractive, by the way, those two things do not necessarily contradict each other, to join or participate in state-sponsored activities for children. There was fun, right, that could be had. So controlling actions is on the one hand. The other, I think, is removing the tools with which one had to think the wrong kinds of thoughts. Taking away options, right, and we've heard this already. By making it illegal, for example, for registered religious groups to engage with people under the age of 18. It wasn't just frowned upon, it was illegal, starting in 1929, to tell somebody under the age of 18 something on a religious topic, right? By ending religious education in pilgrimages. Scott Kenneally writes about this in the 19th century. If you went to primary school, there's a really good shot you went on a pilgrimage to a monastery because your teacher took you there. That was part of your education, right? And so changing that dynamic, changing that activity that would have been part of every kid's life, it's removing a whole vocabulary from childhood, right? It's removing practices that would have been part of childhood and then, no, not going to be part of the new childhood. And I think that's huge. And most egregiously, and this comes about later in the 60s, by equating religious parenting with child abuse. Right? Eventually, they say that children can be removed from the home. Unfit parents are parents who drink or do drugs, or eating doesn't really come up. Sorry, just an aside. Or make their children into believers. Right? Those are equal, right? In terms of what we do. This combo, by the way, is kind of an interesting difference between what happens in the Soviet Union and other Western countries in the 20th century. The century of the child, which is a big quote about the 20th century. It's going to be the century of the child because we're going to increase educational opportunities, we're going to take care of children, we're going to have informed parenting. Secular education is actually part of this. And so what Western countries do is actually secularize education, and they put religious education in the hands of the church and the parents. What does the Soviet Union do? Secularize education and then make it illegal for religious groups and parents to teach their children about religion, right? So I mean, there's a real interesting dividing line. So it's not so much like thought control, we sort of think of Big Brother and monitors and, I don't know, electrodes on our brains or something, as it is narrowing the options, right? Changing the vocabulary from which kids had to work, right? Had to draw. By the way, Yuri Slowsky is going to say they failed at this. He actually argues in this book that, I think the quote is that the Bolsheviks were actually not totalitarian enough in terms of controlling the family, right? Because the ideologues, the ones who truly believed this faith that Wallace talked about, they truly believed that you change the environment, people's thoughts were going to follow, right? And so when it came to bringing a grandmother into the home to be a nanny to the kid, it didn't matter that she was a believer because you were raising your kid in the right way, the right Soviet way. So if she's telling them stories about Jesus, that doesn't matter, right? Whoops. It turns out to matter. Okay. Okay, so that's one thing. And the second is just, I wonder if there's an interesting difference, this is maybe for Dominic, to talk, is there a difference between Christianity and spiritual? It's just an interesting question. I mean, what is it, what would you pinpoint as making unique Christianity in the other sort of ways in which spirituality is practiced in the former Russian Empire and the former Soviet Union? Right, I mean, Victoria Freed argues that atheists in Russia never stopped using religious language and religious images. That atheists in Russia are kind of a weird animal. They don't embrace secularism. They actually just keep using religious language to talk about not believing in God. Okay, so I'm going to stop.
Very rich presentation. I'm going to make a couple of points very quickly. I was also very struck by the he was asking book, but with a couple of disagreements. Three things. First of all, that opening quote about 1913 and people predicting there'll be waves of blood and terrible things are going to happen. There are very few homes in educated Europe where in 1913 you can't find really well documented cases of people saying exactly that. Read what's happening in the Young Circle at that time. There are a series of crises in Europe between 1909 and 1914, and if you're a young guy, you know you're going to die in a war right about 1916. So in other words, this sense of war being imminent is so strong. One of the consequences of that is by 1913 and 1914, there is a deeply apocalyptic, millenarian, messianic culture across Europe, but most deeply rooted in the Orthodox Church and the Orthodox culture. And a great deal of what we call incipient modern art, modern culture, modern music grows out of that. And what I'm trying to make here is that this apocalyptic millenarian culture is so strong. So when the Bolsheviks come along, it's, oh yeah, another millenarian apocalyptic sect. Are you guys Orthodox? And the examples of this, I could give so many. One of the great book of the era is Andrei Biedy's Petersburg. What is this about? Oh, the devil's walking the streets of Petersburg. There are angels everywhere, and the central figure is, guess what? The statue of a horseman that is not just a cavalry general, it's one of the horsemen of the apocalypse. The great artistic school in modern art of the era is the so-called it's Russian and German. Kandinsky's the big figure, is the Blue Rider, as we translate it into English. It's not. It's Blauer Reiter, and it's a horseman, and it grows out of a painting of the apocalypse. And by the way, you mentioned the spiritual. It's not just in Christianity. The other overwhelming movement of this era, which is preaching apocalypse in Russia, is theosophy, and that's that White Brother reference in that Berdiaev quote. One of my favorite artists is Natalia Goncharova. What is a very cutting-edge modern figure. What is she painting at this time? All together now. Angels, archangels, apocalypse. Diaghilev is doing this great presentation of liturgy. She is doing the stage sets with angels. What I'm trying to make is, you cannot get away from this apocalyptic, angelic sense of the end of the world, which I would argue, and this is a whole other thing, has a real strong sense, real strong influence on Tsarist Russian policy and foreign policy. They're circulating these apocryphal gospels, like the Apocalypse of Daniel, which are all about in the last times the Russian Tsar will reoccupy Constantinople, which, well, it has its impact. Okay, so those ideas are very strong, I would say overwhelming. By the way, there are other countries, but they're so deeply rooted in the Orthodox world. And here's a problem. When the communists come along, when the Bolsheviks come along, they have a problem, which is they want to destroy religion, uproot religion, mock religion. But you know what goes and happens? You try and mock religion, and you go and write religious stuff yourself. And there are a couple of great examples of this, but they try, as Julie has been, they use this vicious anti-religious propaganda, but some of it has a sting in the tail. And the great poet of the Russian Revolution is Alexander Blok's The 12. which is all about these boisterous, drunken Red Guards roistering around Petersburg, and wouldn't you know, they're the 12 apostles. If you want to see this problem, that this apocalyptic mode, what should I say, infiltrates Bolshevism, there's one of the most interesting artworks of the Stalinist era, and I'll just describe this very briefly. In 1937, Eisenstein did a film called Bежим Meadow, which you have not seen because it's a lost film. But we know enough of it from stills, and you can actually do a kind of restoration of part of it. And there's this violent anti-clerical, anti-religious scene where all the peasants storm into the church and they sack it and they take all the jewels and the crowns, and then one of the women dresses up as the Virgin Mary and so on. And it's meant to be a vicious anti-religious attack. And when you look at it, it looks like one of the great religious films because it's about the millenarian apotheosis of ordinary poor villagers into saints and the Virgin. And so he always has this problem. It uses this apocalyptic ideology, millenarian ideology, and somehow they cannot avoid presenting Christian ideas that they absolutely don't want to present. The end. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we should just go straight to questions. Thank you for all those. There's a lot to think about, but you guys spoken enough. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I enjoyed the paper. And to me, if you really would like to understand what is the state of religion in the Soviet Union or the state of Orthodox Church in Soviet Union, you have to really understand what happened in late 1800s as well as early 1900s. And you a couple of times said about Tolstoy, as somebody here, you mentioned about Tolstoy's attack. To see your opinion, what is your vision in terms of tensions between Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church, as well as social forces, and how does Tolstoy play it?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, something that struck me in Alexander Ben's response to the joyous and triumphalistic centenaries of the church, was it in 1988, where he pointed out that he was one of the few clerical voices to say there was a lack of humility there in recognising the oppression that the church had been guilty of, and to some extent, the church's responsibility for, to some degree, enabling the revolution to happen. So, with that in mind, I was looking at Tolstoy not so long ago, and he was making this point about the church hypnotizing people. That's a word he comes back to again and again. Hypnotism into the cult of the state. And he calls it, he doesn't mince any words by calling it a pagan order, using Christian language, and he sort of takes the catechisms and say, how can the Bible say this, and how can the Orthodox Church justify that? So he sort of sets these two up in pretty, he distances himself fairly vigorously from those two and sort of predicts this clash. And I take this point about the widespread nature of this apocalyptic thinking, but Tolstoy is pretty precise about it. He says this revolutionary model is going to be impoverished because of its violence, but he doesn't pull his punches about the church. And the final thing to add to that is Nicholas Zernov's point. It sounds bizarre, but he says the revolution itself was the revenge of the intelligentsia against the secularized empire of Peter the Great, that they were in that tradition of frustration that the church had sort of rolled over in complicity with an essentially secular order. And then, of course, he says the revolution committed suicide on itself, or the intelligentsia sort of killed itself through Bolshevik sort of violence. So those themes are definitely there, but Tolstoy is strikingly explicit about really the responsibility of the church. And I mentioned those chapters, Jeremy Fagan's one and Michael Ball, and Michael's article is still fizzing with his own sense of grievance at the way the Orthodox Church stifled its own voices and sent its own people, in a sense, to Italy, into the prison camps. Any other questions? Or, please direct to the panel as well as me. Just if I could, while anyone's thinking, respond to this point about spiritual and Christian. That's one of the quotes from Pasternak that I've truncated. Actually contains this idea from Uncle Collier, who is a progressive journalist, but he was a priest. He says you can be true to Christ in a way that without necessarily believing in God, if you believe in these ways. And you have people in Lawrence Hapley's chapter who are saying this sort of intimate collaboration between non-believing human rights activists and Christians, and one Christian, one Orthodox priest writing saying, I hasten to establish a common language with you, and suggesting, it sounds patronising, but suggesting that you use the word beauty when I talk of God. And then you have others who say, those who are struggling to support believers even though they don't believe, and Sakharov would be an example. Sakharov is very much a secular saint. In fact, I wouldn't use the word secular, and many references to the Good Samaritan, where the Good Samaritan is the non-Orthodox or the so that he certainly not the insider. So there is much interplay, and that's what I kind of like about Pasternak and this new Christianity, this Christianity of deed, which rules kind of conscious and articulate belief to some extent.
Question for Wallace. When you talk about the tragedy of the revolution, and I certainly agree with that in many ways, but in order to judge as a tragedy, you have to, it would seem that it should be compared to some other possibility. What might Russia have been if it had not been for the revolution? Is that something you have, given that we sort of reached this conclusion about tragedy, can you have any sort of speculation that you enter into what might have been in Russia absent the revolution?
As a historian, I always tell my students, don't ask me if questions. If this had not happened, what would have taken place? But one really cannot avoid thinking about trends. When you look at the beginning of the 20th century, Russia, even though it's a peasant country, had one of the highest economic growth rates in the world. It was in the midst of an experiment with parliamentary government, although there were problems with that, to be sure. But the trends were moving in that direction. It had a brilliant, flowering classical culture. A group of theologian philosophers in the early 20th century who were among the world's finest, Berdyaev being one of them, who's been mentioned several times today. Educational levels were rising. You think of a fairly, by the way, there was a greater integration into Europe, Western Europe, and also the world at that time than Russia had for some time. So one cannot help but think that without 1917, today you can't imagine a Joseph Stalin. I can't imagine a totally democratic society, but I can imagine a more open society, a more tolerant society, and a society that's more fully integrated into the world economy, into the global framework than we see right now. When you look at the deaths in the 20th century that came out of the revolution and followed with some of its events later, the figure 100 million is often bandied around. And you think of, without the revolution, not being rosy-colored and thinking of an open democratic society, I'm just convinced things would have been much different and much more pleasant.
will be able to autograph for you if you so choose. We also have Russian-themed refreshments available and the opportunity to continue conversation in the beautiful Garden of Contentment